So today's episode is all about carbon pricing, carbon taxes, emissions trading schemes, also called ETS, cap and trade, etc. Governments use tools like carbon taxes and emission trading systems to reduce pollution that causes climate change. These tools work by making it more expensive to release greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, which should encourage businesses to cut emissions. In Asia, several countries like China, South Korea, and New Zealand are already running their own ETS. But one thing to keep in mind is each country's ETS is different. Now, the European Union, the EU emissions trading scheme, also called EU ETS, started in 2005. It covers power plants, factories, and even airlines, and limits or caps how much they can pollute. So if a company wants to emit more, it must buy extra permits. So the EU ETS has helped cut pollution by over a third in some sectors and has raised billions of euros to support green energy and climate action. Victor, did I get that right? Is there anything that you want to correct about that?
I think, David, you pretty much covered most of the bases of why we're even talking about putting a price of carbon and then the various mechanisms there to help incentivize companies or countries to decarbonize.
Okay, great. Now we can get into more detail. We're going to play the conversation we had earlier with Professor Shreekant Gupta. Dr. Shreekant Gupta is a visiting senior fellow at the Center for Social and Economic Progress in New Delhi, with over 30 years of experience at the intersection of policy and economics. I like that he calls himself an accidental economist, and the environment. He has advised organizations like the ADB, OECD, UNDP, and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. He was a part of that. He is deeply passionate about environment and particularly the biggest challenge that we face, which is climate change. So let's dive in. Here's our talk with Professor Shreekant Gupta. Hello and welcome to Green Shift, where we try to make sense of sustainability. I'm your host, David Austin, and I'm joined by my co-host, Dr. Victor Nian. Executive producer Jordan Cronin is also online. And today we're joined by Professor Shreekant Gupta. Welcome, Shreekant.
Thank you for having me.
Did you want to kick us off with a little bit of a primer? What is carbon pricing and why is it important?
Combining these domains of economics and environment actually is quite useful. And economists always talk about prices. And we price, and price signals something is scarce. So we have a price. We walk into a shop, we pay for something. So the whole idea with carbon pricing is that the carbon or CO2 that is being put out by all of us as consumers when we drive our vehicles and burn coal or whatever to produce electricity that powers our homes, we are really not paying for it. We for example, we pay for the petrol or whatever when we drive the car, but we don't pay for the emissions that come out of the car, including the CO2. So the notion of carbon pricing is quite simple, actually. It's like you price things so that you send a signal that we must be more judicious in our use of it. So carbon pricing really combines our goal of protecting and preserving the environment and dealing with the problem of global warming, more accurately called climate change, and using the power of the markets. So we are harnessing the power of the market by sending a price signal, which then becomes a signal for us to protect the environment. So it's a kind of a win-win, the whole notion of pricing and the notion of carbon pricing.
You've also written a lot about ETS and carbon tax. Can you give us a little bit more details about that?
Yes, sure. So, ultimately, the planet is facing this existential crisis of climate change. And we all know that, most of us know that we must drive towards net zero emissions of greenhouse gases, which effectively means zero emissions, but some small amount of emissions that may still happen can be offset by things like afforestation and so on. So broadly speaking, the world has to go towards net zero greenhouse gas emissions. And therefore, each country has to go towards net zero greenhouse gas emissions. At the same time, we do have to have economic growth, particularly in our part of the world, in Southeast Asia and South Asia. We also need the economy to grow to create jobs and so on. So, how do you reconcile these sort of objectives where we want to drive down our greenhouse gas emissions to zero and increase the size of the economic pie? Well, among other things, pricing does that. So, for example, as I mentioned, through carbon pricing, you can essentially send signals which incentivize alternative technologies, which we already have. We have renewables and similar things. But the idea is that the price signal incentivizes research and development, it incentivizes innovation, and incentivizes investments in renewables. Each country, now just talking about specific countries, for example, China has committed to net zero emissions by 2060. The European Union, which is not in our part of the world, but is a very important proactive player in climate change, has agreed to net zero by 2050. So, having agreed to this goal and doing a whole slew of policies in our part of the world, predominantly countries have moved towards carbon markets, which is what you called emissions trading. So there's trading. Well, trading, as we all know, is buying and selling. You can trade in a stock exchange and you can buy and sell stock. Essentially, trading is what is all economic activity about. There is a buyer and there is a seller. In our part of the world, emissions trading, trading in the emissions or the greenhouse gas emissions or carbon dioxide emissions, has been the sort of the dominant way that our region has gone about, and we can talk more about it. But countries such as New Zealand, China, so many other countries, Korea, South Korea, have been going towards emissions trading.
So maybe we can talk about how it actually works, right? So you have entities that are going to be subjected to the ETS. You have allowances. Maybe speak to that, maybe some of the nuances when it comes to the ETS, since it's a little bit more complex.
I think the American phrase for emissions trading is a little bit more communicative, like most American phrases, which is cap and trade. The cap and trade essentially means that you put a cap, a ceiling, and the ceiling that you put on the emissions is less than the business as usual. So, for example, suppose you want to cut down your emissions by 50% and you have 100 units, you declare a cap of 50. So there is a binding cap, and that is also what you're calling allowances. And then uh, you allow within that tighter cap emitters of CO2, for example, to buy and sell emissions, which essentially means that we have an initial allowance which we can then sell or buy. Now, why should this buying and selling take place? Because you see, different firms have different ways of reducing emissions. Some are more efficient, some are less, some are more costly, some are less. So the whole idea that economists have put forward in terms of a market in emissions is that the firms that can do it at lower cost can do more and then really sell their emissions to firms that are less able to do it. So it's like a license to pollute. If I uh, get the license, somebody else loses it. So when you buy and sell, if I buy a unit of emissions from you, then I am entitled to emit one more unit, but you have to then do one less. Of course, this predicated on the idea that there is good monitoring and verification of emissions, but those problems have been fairly successfully addressed in systems that exist around the world. So, to summarize, emissions trading is essentially buying and selling of emissions, and the buying and selling of emissions is feasible because the amount that you allow in the market, the cap, is lower than the business as usual.
The way that you've described it so far, are you speaking just about like mandatory or voluntary or both?
Yes. So, in a textbook world, there is a announcement. So what we in jargon call a compliance market. So there is a regulation that now we will have emissions trading. These are the entities that are covered. This is the total amount of the cap or the total allowance, which is then distributed amongst the players in the market in various ways. You can sell it, you can give it out free based on your current levels. There's so many different ways to allocate it. So that's a compliance market. And as you mentioned, in contrast to that, you have a voluntary market in which essentially people can come and participate on a voluntary basis. Sometimes that goes by the jargon VCM, voluntary carbon markets. And then there is a third kind, which is essentially not a full-blown market, but it's an offset. So basically, if I increase my emissions by say 10 units, I get the offset in some other by some other player, and the offsets can also be across the world, right? So, for example, Singapore has been very active in this. And this probably don't want to get into too many technical details, but we had this very important agreement called the Paris Agreement, where countries said they will come together and try to cut their emissions. And there is a particular part of the Paris Agreement called Article 6, in which allows countries to offset, essentially pay other people to reduce emissions. Now, of course, that may sound morally repugnant that, oh, you're letting others do your work, but it's subject to some ceiling. So, for example, in Singapore, the entities that are being subject to, say, the carbon tax can up to 5% of their emissions they can offset from other parts of the world. So it's not like they're getting a total free ride. So to summarize, you have the compliance market, then you have the voluntary market, you have the offset market. So there are different flavors. But if you ask me, eventually the idea is to move towards the compliance market, but take baby steps towards it. So we start with offsets, we can start with voluntary markets, but ultimately you would want to go to a compliance market, which is a kind of a nationwide market, ideally a global market. So we can talk about how you can link different countries together. The emissions trading systems in different countries can be connected. So the global market is a sort of an organic growth. But that apart, we would ideally want a market where entities are all somehow mandated to not just because of the goodness of their heart, but because they're mandated to do it. And then you let the market work its magic. To make it more tangible, let's see a picture where how the European Union has been doing it. And actually, the European Union has been using emissions trading. So what you can probably see on the screen right now is a line going up, a line going down. So in the European Union, the economy has grown by about 68% over the last 30 odd years. At the same time, their greenhouse gas emissions have gone down by 37%. This is what we mean by decoupling. And this is really what is the goal of, meaningful action on climate change. The meaningful action is that we want this to go down to 100% reduction, and we want the economies to keep growing, particularly, well, the EU is a richer part of the world, but in our part of the world, say, for example, Southeast Asia and countries there, we want this decoupling. Now, I would argue one of the main things that the EU has done to generate this kind of a picture is emissions trading, which is called the EU ETS, the European Union Emissions Trading System, which dates back to 2005. So they've been at it for about 20 years, and they've had a lot of experience and ways to fine tune it. But this is really the whole idea when we're driving towards net zero, this whole notion of decoupling and how carbon pricing and carbon markets in particular can get us to this point. Also, if I may be allowed a little bit of an intellectual history of this. Here is a little picture of this book written by this, interestingly, a political scientist. He was not an economist. And his name was J.H. Dales, and he was at the University of Toronto. And way back in 1968, almost 60 years ago, he wrote this little booklet called Pollution, Property, and Prices, where he was the one who proposed this kind of a very interesting idea called markets in pollution rights, which is essentially what we're talking about. emissions trading. So what I'm really trying to say is that this is not a new idea. It's been kicking around for a long time. Like I said, way back in 1968. And environmental economists, particularly in the United States, have been at it. And this idea that Dale's put forward of markets and pollution rights was very successfully mapped into sulfur dioxide trading in the United States. So, what happened in the United States is that their coal is very high sulfur content. When you burn this sulfur, it goes up in the air and causes acid rain. So, very briefly, what they did in the United States was they started trading in sulfur dioxide, and like I said, it's allowing them to buy and sell. I mean, this kind of conceptual idea put forward in 1968 was fairly successfully implemented in the United States for trading in sulfur dioxide emissions. Sulfur dioxide is created by power plants when they burn high sulfur coal, which was, like I said, an environmental problem. It causes acid rain. So it's sometimes called the acid rain program. And as you can see, it goes back quite some time back. Their main regulator, the Environmental Protection Agency, did exactly what I was saying. They did a cap and trade, and this cap kept going down. So they really had an initial emissions of, say, about 19 million tons, which went down to almost half, 10 million tons. There was buying and selling, and ultimately the proof of the pudding is in the eating. And basically what has been found is that by this buying and selling of SO2 emissions, mortality risk, people falling sick or dying prematurely, has gone down. The program has been considered a success. It's no longer in place now, but while it ran, it was successful. The allowances or the entitlements or the licenses to pollute were traded in the Chicago Stock Exchange. And reason I'm telling you all this is that, these are not very bookish ideas. These are real ideas. So these two pictures give you the sort of the intellectual antecedents and real world practical examples of how this has happened.
Shrikant, I wanted to hop in really quickly just to add to that point, because I did a little research before the episode, and it turns out, to your point about decoupling, it's not just with the economy and decarbonization, but it's also with electricity generation and reduction in pollution. So that same acid rain program saw an increase at the same time, 26% of electricity generated from coal, 26% at the same time, a 43% decrease in SO2. So we can decouple not just economic growth and decarbonization, but also pollution and electricity generation. Just to add to your point.
Yes. Yes, exactly. So that's really thank you, Jordan.
And I thought the decoupling chart also is really good just for anyone that thinks that decarbonizing is going to be a drag on the economy. I mean, you can see right there, it's patently not true, right? I mean, the economy can grow while you're reducing carbon emissions, which I think more people need to see that chart more often. Yeah.
When it comes to offsetting, let's say using nature-based solutions, how do we hold companies or corporations responsible for making sure that the carbon credits that they're buying are indeed credible carbon credits, and to make sure that if something happens, then the companies can also find ways to make sure that to protect themselves from greenwashing if it's indeed not their fault. But if it's happening, if it's indeed greenwashing, then how can other organizations or third parties be able to detect and prevent this from happening, to make sure that we are indeed, playing our part to be environmentally responsible?
That's a very good question, because obviously these are real practical problems and they keep coming up. And as you said, that gives emissions trading a bad name. In my personal view, the quicker we move to a proper compliance market with well-defined emitters and well-defined caps, the total amount and the allocation plans, the better it is. The voluntary markets or the offset markets, and there are what's called the baseline and credit that the Australians do. There's so many things, but ideally, countries in our region which are starting emissions trading must move to a EU ETS type system where all the players are defined. So there isn't this open-endedness that, okay, you're getting this so-called hot air, this sort of free emissions coming up. and there is no sort of a uniform solution. But firstly, of course, monitoring, reporting, and verification, which is in jargon called MRV, that's really central to it. Creating an emissions registry, and then I think the important thing is this again jargonistic thing called additionality, which is that what you are doing in terms of reducing emissions and claiming credit for is something over and above that you would have been doing in any case. So in a way, what you're saying can be captured by the price. If you have this kind of greenwashing and fudging in a way, the price that comes out in the carbon market will be fairly low. Now, for example, look at the European Union, which I keep harking back to as close to a well-functioning CO2 market as you think. And by the way, there's not just CO2; they have now brought many other gases into the greenhouse gases into their basket. And the price in the European Union is now something like 80 euros in that ballpark, which is a significant price. So, in a sense, when you look at the prices, you can get a sense of whether the market is really functioning or not. So, I think these are problems, but these are not insurmountable in my view.
Yeah, I totally agree. The price does reflect the confidence. In fact, so that's the reason why if you look at the forest carbon, credit today, the price is really way going below, what we think they could have been many, many years ago. I mean, going below $1 per ton is really a signal that, people are losing confidence. But of course, my second point about double counting is also to say that, this is also something that the measurement, reporting, and verification organization, or independent third party needs to play a role. Another way to look at it also is, when companies are saying we are buying green electricity or carbon credit from a renewable farm, say especially when it's cross border, say countries buying country in Europe buying carbon credit from a country that is generating this from renewable energy in Asia, for example, they can claim offset, right? Because their buying carbon credit is properly verified, registered, listed, and they buy from the carbon exchange. They do the offsetting. But at the same time, when we start to look at the national greenhouse gas inventory and even looking at their own national emission reduction trajectory, to put it simply, the grid emission factor, which every country uses as a way of calculating emissions, the countries would naturally factor in the amount of renewable energy that is generated within this territory. So, sometimes people say, hey, wait a minute. The countries are claiming reductions from the grid emission factor. Out there, a company in Europe is also claiming offset from the same renewable farm. How can this work? I mean, if you work out the total, this is essentially double counting in two parts of the world, right? I mean, so in your view, what do you think that we could do about this?
Oh, that's a very good question. So obviously, only one of them can claim it, and if the money has moved, so if the money has moved from, say, the European country to the country, then the country that has received the money for the offsets cannot then claim that as a part of its own reductions. And I think that this is really a question, again, as I said, of MRV.
MRV, measurement, reporting, and verification. Where are we as far as, I mean, harmonization? Like, is there one entity that does this? Is it a network of entities? Are there private companies, or is it through the UN? What's the status of MRV?
Well, there is something called the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which is, I think, implemented jointly through the World Resources Institute and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, which is based in Geneva. So protocols are in place, and as Victor was also mentioning, each country has a reporting requirement to the UN. The UN. Again, a piece of jargon, but the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. A little clunky word, but UNFCCC. So UNFCCC, UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So international bureaucrats come up with these, but that's really the main architecture globally. And under that, all countries that have signed on, which is everyone, has to report its emissions, its greenhouse gas emissions periodically, and there are certain standardized ways of doing it. Uh, so that's one aspect of it at the national level, what are called the national inventories, which Victor was alluding to. And then, of course, at the firm level or people emitting, there are, and earlier also, I think Victor mentioned scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, which is essentially, at which level you measure emissions. And there are more technical details which we can get into. But the whole idea is that, yes, there are protocols, and the greenhouse gas protocol, which is set up by these two entities, are manuals and books and how these things should be done. But ultimately, the monitoring, the reporting, and the verification has to be done by the national government.
Looking again at Southeast Asia, do you envision in 5, 10, 15 years or sometime in the future where there could be a harmonization within ASEAN around carbon pricing? And if you do, what would that look like? And if not, what do you think are the impediments to that goal?
Okay, well, that's an interesting question. So obviously, look, we all know that when we're looking at the ASEAN or even broadly Asia, countries are at very different levels of economic development. Countries are at very different levels in terms of the nature of their emissions. So obviously, if you look at a country like Indonesia, there's a lot of emissions from deforestation. If you look at a country like New Zealand, a large part of its emissions are essentially methane, which come from livestock. So the emissions profiles of these countries are different, the levels of economic development are different, and their capacity to implement any sort of a market or a carbon tax varies quite greatly. So at this current juncture, I think what's really important is that all countries must move very, in a very determined way towards the sort of the gold standard, so to speak. And Singapore has moved towards a carbon tax. Ultimately, the whole idea we started this conversation, we're talking about the price. So hopefully and ideally, there should be a harmonized price across the ASEAN. And if you just talk to economists in a global sense, there should be a globally harmonized price of CO2, which again, there's this jargon called the social cost of carbon. What is the price? Because remember, CO2 emissions are global. A ton of CO2 emitted in Brazil and in New Zealand, they all have the same impact. So in that sense, the price should be the same in theory across the world, but it's really difficult. EU has a $80, 80 euro price. Uh, so, so to answer your question, I think that yes, eventually we hope to see a harmonized price, but we are still a long way from it. But what we really want to see right now is that in each country, there is a price which is significantly higher than zero, maybe $20, $30. And Singapore, again, obviously being a richer, advanced country with a much better administrative capacity and institutional strengths, is very rapidly increasing its CO2 prices, as you know, through the tax. The tax is being ratcheted up very fast, and probably $50 very soon, from $5 per ton not too far back. If you think of a country like Thailand, Malaysia, Vietnam, they're just starting off, but they're serious. And so they have a roadmap. So we are all at different places, and eventually, hopefully, we will converge. So I think that's the best I can say. What I really wanted to also share with viewers was this particular report, which has just been put out by the Lee Kuan Yew School and the UNDP about carbon taxes. And why I really wanted to share this was that there is a deep dive into the Singapore carbon tax, where, as you can see from this little picture, which obviously is telling us this is Singapore, is that it's really gone up very drastically. One thing that has really loomed on the horizon is this carbon border adjustment mechanism, the CBAM, as it's called, CBAM. And basically, the CBAM's origin is in the European Union, where the European Union feels that since they have a fairly robust system of pricing carbon, and the price of CO2 emissions is fairly high, like I mentioned, countries that are exporting into the EU are getting an unfair advantage. So, for example, if there's a steel producer, let's say India, which produces steel and exports it to the EU or countries such as Indonesia and so on, China, for example, who are not pricing carbon in their own country or not pricing it at the same level are getting an unfair advantage. So the carbon border adjustment mechanism is exactly what it says. It's an adjustment at the EU border. So for example, if my CO2 is priced at 20 euros per ton of CO2 and the EU price is 80, then I am going to charge that extra 60 so that we have a level playing field. What is really not understood is that you can always look at this as a threat, as a trade barrier, and countries in our part of the world are quite upset about it. I have a slightly more heterodox position on this. I believe that the carbon border adjustment mechanism is a kind of an incentive for us to start pricing carbon in our own countries. And there are obviously problems with carbon pricing in terms of their impacts on, equity and distribution, but we can talk about that at another time. So, for example, if the CBAM is coming into Indonesia, it's also a incentive for Indonesia to start pricing its CO2, obviously not at the very high levels of the EU, but moving in that direction, which also gives space for negotiation for countries that saying, okay, you're going to put a tax on us because we are having either a zero or a very low price on CO2. You have a very high price, but we are moving in this direction. So it's an opportunity. I think the mistake that countries in our region are making is that we are simply thinking of this as a threat and doubling down on it and saying that it's a protectionist measure. I personally may be a little bit an outlier on this, but I do believe that the genesis of the CBAM is not in trade protectionism. It's about the Europeans being very serious about pricing their own carbon.
That's a very good answer, Shrikant. I think this is really helpful for people to have an understanding of it, because right now, CBAM has always been seen as a tool against developing countries rather than really an environmental tool to reduce emissions. And especially because they're targeting the four sectors CBAM is targeting is primarily located in developing countries. And which is why also attracting the question, who is CBAM designed for and what is really the true purpose? But this explanation is very, very helpful. Thank you so much.
Well, Victor, I'm in ground zero. I'm in India, and it's almost like a nationalistic thing that, oh, these guys are malified and they're out to, pardon my language, they're out to screw us.
Mhm.
Well, de facto, that makes situation, but in principle, that's not, they didn't wake up one morning. They're serious about pricing. And this is something that we can pick up in another conversation is there is this notion called EITE, which is emissions intensive and trade exposed. So right now, what is happening in the EU is that their players, their dirty industries, there is a section of their industries which are dirty and exposed to trade, are exempt from the EU ETS. So those guys are getting a free pass. The EITE, this is a standard jargon, emissions intensive and trade exposed. So there's a lot of trade, say in steel or aluminum, and they're very dirty. So right now, those firms are being given free allowances in the EU ETS or just being kept out of it. Now they're saying, we're going to bring you guys into our ETS. We want our ETS to be comprehensive. But then there is this problem of Indian steel. Let me just talk about India. The Indian steel coming in, which is dirtier. And ironically, Indians are producing steel in two places. Mittal is producing steel in the EU, and then they're also producing in India, right? So the whole idea is that Indian steel is coming in. Indians, let's say, are pricing their CO2 as zero, and Europeans are pricing it at 80 euros. Now, come on, that's so so now what is the message I can take? I can either take it as a threat, a challenge, fight it all the way to the WTO, where we are saying, well, this is a protectionist measure. The Europeans are saying, no, this is not protectionist. This is for our environment. And we can do it. And the WTO, as we all know, is dead because of all that's happening. Or the Indians can say, okay, we have an Indian carbon market. We are moving in that direction. We may not obviously price it at 80, but we're moving in that direction. So guys, give us a window where we can, breathing space where we can come in. So that's a constructive way of doing it. And to be very serious, I presented this view to the Confederation of Indian Industry And I told them, look, this is the way you guys should think about it. And they're actually doing it. So the Indian carbon market, which is an emissions intensity market, is not even looking at the power sector, which is very counterintuitive, because I think that the first thing you must do in carbon trading is look at the coal base. The Indians are bringing it in for steel, for aluminum, for the ones that we are selling to the EU. So we are really doing it. And that, I think, is the way we must think about it, because the other ways of thinking about it are counterproductive and are not going to get us anywhere.
Mm. Yeah, and I think I totally agree on that point, which I think essentially then brings to maybe the next conversation. We can talk about harmonization or compatibility, or rather even interoperability of the global carbon market. EU, you have a carbon market. There is one in China, there's one in India. ASEAN is looking at its own carbon trading. So where are the compatibility, in terms of harmonizing regulations, standards, codes and standards, and eventually all the markets can then, I wouldn't say converge, but then at least reach to some degree of consensus, in which, exactly your point, you have countries that are a bit later on in the decarbonization journey time to catch up. Rather than saying, hey, everybody has a common cutoff, otherwise everybody gets penalized. Maybe we have a phased approach, a timeline in which to get all the country on board. I think that is really the final objective of having, the carbon pricing or having a carbon market.
No, absolutely. We are obviously at very different levels of economic development and in terms of capacity and institutional and governance capacity. So we obviously can't all become Singapore or the EU. But the principle is really important. The idea of these markets taking root. The phrase that I really use about the ASEAN is proto ETS. So these are ETSs which are growing organically, but I think the idea that has to be seeded into the minds of people is that pricing is good, pricing is not evil, pricing synergizes a goal. I mean, those sorts of broad issues.
Yeah, thank you so much. And this is going to be continued. We barely scratched the surface, and I know there's so much more to get into. So we'll have you back again and again until we're all experts on carbon prices.
Until I reach the limits of my own knowledge.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Questions. Okay, bye now.
Bye.
I know.
Bye.